teach in the psychology department, psychology as a natural science, which is an AU core course. And my background is in educational psychology. So I'm very interested in the research around pedagogy and what practices we know based on research that we should be implementing for our students. And so the idea for this workshop is to have these research-based principles kind of drive the topics that I'm going to talk about. And so I'll have these kind of big categories. Cognitive load is going to be one of those. And then what that translates to for online teaching and learning. And similar to a lot of great practices for pedagogy, most of these techniques and strategies can be implemented in face-to-face courses too, of course. So the learning outcomes for this workshop were to summarize research-based best practices for online teaching, assess your own ability to implement some new instructional strategies, and then efficiently create an implementation strategy in your online course. So as Lindsay went through, I'm going to go through kind of the ground rules, which I think just build on what Lindsay said. I'm going to talk about some logistical recommendations and some of the terminology with online courses, and then getting into the pedagogical research and the relevant strategies for each of those topics. And then once I get through all of the topics, I'm going to then just move into a question and answer period. I really wanted that to be the focus because I know that there's a lot of questions. We're getting a lot of requests for one-off questions and other types of workshops. And so I'm really interested in hearing what questions you have, what things do you want to know? Hey, should I be doing it this way? Should I think about this way? That's what I want to be kind of the drive after I kind of go through all of the research and what that means for online teaching. So the ground rules, as Lindsay said, just type any questions in the chat. I can't see them right now, but Lindsay will alert me if something comes up, and we'll just relay them to me at the end if it makes more sense for the end, but just feel free to keep throwing them in the chat. And then keep your microphone and video muted, but we'll see what happens whenever we move into the question and answer portion. I wasn't sure how many people there would be. There's about 50 last time I looked at the participant list, so we might maybe keep microphones chat on mute, and we'll see what happens. And so this is also a really great practice to implement with your students. For every single synchronous session you might be having, whenever you're having a Zoom meeting like this, it's really good to kind of just set the rules right off the bat, because every class is different. Every topic might be different. I typically don't like to say, keep your microphone on mute, but I do have 40 students. And so for the full course, when I have all my students in the room, I do want them to be on mute, and then kind of save the talking to each other for another setting. So first, of course, we have to talk about learning outcomes, not just because that's our favorite thing to talk about, but because it's really important whenever you're thinking about online teaching, and especially when you're potentially transitioning some courses to online that have been face-to-face in the past. Look at your learning outcomes, revamp your learning outcomes, and be really purposeful about what it is you want students to be able to do at the end of your course. And that will really help whenever you're trying to make decisions about what you should do. And so if you're thinking about, should I make a discussion board this week, or should I do a Zoom class this week, or what should I do for my class for this topic? Going back to the learning outcome can be essential just to make this an easier decision for you. So perhaps your learning outcome is to distinguish the different outlets for peer-reviewed research. So that might be a good discussion board question. Thinking about, like, if at the end of the class, that's what I want them to be doing, a discussion board with the right prompts can be suitable for that. A Zoom conversation might not be the most suitable way to do that. And so it can be really helpful. It feels tedious sometimes, but it can be really helpful to make sure that the learning outcomes are kind of driving all of your decision making. I find that it's really helpful for me too. I think about teaching all the time. I plan my course planning time to be limited, because otherwise I will plan all the time because I love it. And so it really helps me to just say, no, I need to do a Zoom call this week because that's what I'm trying to do. And so Bloom's Taxonomy is a really great resource. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Bloom's Taxonomy. This is one that we created from CTRL, and it distinguishes all of the different learning outcome verbs in a hierarchical order. And so it starts at the bottom with these lower order thinking skills. And the idea here is that these aren't going to take as much to kind of be able to do. And then you get up into these higher order thinking skills of create and evaluate. It just gives a nice way to kind of see what types of things you're expecting students to do. And so it doesn't mean that all of the remember and understand learning outcomes at the bottom are going to be all you have for a 100-level course. These are going to vary within the course, between courses, from week to week. You can pick and choose from all of these. It's just a nice logical way to think about what it is that you actually want your students to be doing. So then logistical recommendations, and again, some of the terminology, asynchronous or synchronous. And so asynchronous refers to work that students can be doing on their own time. And so they can do it at their own pace. Discussion boards on Blackboard are a good example of this. Having an exam that they do at their own time, readings that they do at their own time, those all fall within this asynchronous category. And then synchronous refers to what we're doing right now, where we're in real time talking to each other and you're attending this workshop with me. And so there's pros and cons to both. Asynchronous has a lot of pros because it's kind of contingency plans for anything that can go wrong. And so if someone's internet breaks down, they're not going to miss the entire Zoom call. They can go and watch the recording of it whenever they have time. But again, you're not going to be able to get to all of your learning outcomes potentially. And so synchronous might be important to have as well, where you have these face-to-face kind of Zoom conversations. And so there's a reason to implement both for sure. And so only implement synchronous activity at your designated assigned class time. You can have options for kind of some one-off meetings and scheduling other meetings, but just be really mindful that those class times were designated. You might cut into someone else's class time potentially. And then for any synchronous sessions you might have, just like we're doing today, try to record your sessions so that students can access them at another time. Technical instructions for new tools. So there is a myth that is within higher education and beyond higher education about digital natives. And so the idea here is that students come to our classes ready to use any technology we might throw at them. And what research has found is that this is not true, and the differences between generations are not as big as what we might be thinking and perceiving. And so what this means for online teaching and any teaching is that they need explicit technical instructions for any tools that they're using. Even if it's Zoom, it might feel like next semester all of our students are going to know how to use Zoom, but maybe they're not using Zoom in the way that you're going to be using Zoom. Maybe they've never had to use their video before, and you might have a situation where you'd like them to use their video. The technical instructions really just puts them all in an equal playing field for engaging in the activity, so they don't have to focus on how to make Zoom work and how to do all these technical things. They can focus their limited cognitive load on the content for the course. So this could include things like having links to Blackboard help, having a tutorial video, and just making sure that you have all of these instructions in many different places. So even whenever I have students embed a video into a discussion board post, I share those instructions every single time, or I remind them where they can go and find that information. And I still get questions about it. So the third logistical recommendation is when you think about time to complete assignments. An example of this might be a discussion board. And so making sure that not only that you give ample time to do these things, account for the fact that what if a student doesn't have internet for 2 days or access to the computer for 2 days or whatever it is, giving them ample time, but then also giving them time structured in a way that works for whatever it is that you're doing. So for a discussion board, having one due date for that initial post. So maybe by Monday morning, they have to put their initial post. And then by Thursday, they have to reply to 2 or 3 of their colleagues. So just thinking through not just giving them enough time, but as much structure as you can provide for these things, especially for situations where you're kind of trying to mimic this interaction, giving them ample time both to the initial post and then for the replies is essential. And then finally, open educational resources are amazing for use in any course. These refer to open, free, and accessible course materials for students to use. So one example of this are the OpenStax textbooks. And they have a series of textbooks that are freely available as a PDF. Students can purchase the hard copy if they want to, but they don't have to. And so what's really nice is that they have this resource from day one, and they have it no matter where they go. And this can be really helpful for an online course, but again, for any course. And so thinking back to the spring, whenever we had to quickly move to online, it was helpful because students already had the textbook. They didn't have to go and retrieve it. But then thinking about it for your online course, you don't have to worry about students not getting the textbook for 2 weeks into the course. They have those materials from day one. And then thinking about longevity, they'll have those materials forever. They can go and access them. Okay, so on to some of the research. And one of the things I talk about a lot is learning styles. And so the myth about learning styles is really helpful to think about, again, for this and for any course. There is no research to show that learning styles is a phenomena that we need to consider. And so what this means is that perhaps many of us have heard of learning styles, been tested for learning styles. And what the research shows is that even if we test students and then we find out if they're a visual learner or an auditory learner, tactile learner, whatever they all are, and then we match the instruction to their learning style, what we find is that there's no difference. They don't learn any better. And so it's not terrible, but it's also, it can be a waste of time. You don't have to be doing those things. And so what we can look to the learning styles research, students of course have preferences, and that's really helpful to think about for motivation. But what we know is that multiple modalities is best. And so this means not just including a graph of information for who might be a visual learner in your class, but making sure that you have the graph and something else, because that's going to make sure that all of your students learn the information. So having a reading and a recorded lecture, and then having a Blackboard discussion board, and then having an existing YouTube video. So having it in multiple ways. Obviously, don't get into an overkill where you have too many things, but the more the better, and that's what we show is really helpful for retention and making sure students understand whatever it is you're trying to teach them. And so again, this is true for in-person, and it's also true for online. Okay, so cognitive load is another topic. We've heard of cognitive load. You've likely heard of working memory. A lot of us think about the 7 ± 2 as how much capacity we have for working memory. But what this really is saying is that we have limited working memory, all of us, not just our students, not just children, adults have limited working memory, and we can only do so much. And so a lot of the research on memory has been really helpful for knowing what we should be doing in these instructional settings. So multiple screens and videos. So this might be thinking about if you have a talking head and a PowerPoint, whenever you have that recorded video, it can be helpful to maybe limit it to either the talking head or to the PowerPoint. This also relates to simple design and Meyer's principles for multimedia learning. The idea here is that if you can make it simpler, that's the best idea. If you're going to add a photo just for the sake of adding a photo, think about why you're adding the photo. Does it make it kind of more concrete for students? Then absolutely include the photo. Just thinking about being really intentional about whatever it is that you are putting on your slides and in your content. So transcripts, where at all possible, are essential. And this is helpful for your own videos. So even if you just have a list of notes, having that transcript can be really helpful for making sure that you don't go off task, of course. but this is also really helpful for creating captions, which we'll talk about in accessibility. In terms of giving students information in multiple formats, giving them the transcript so that they can read along as they watch the video can be another really helpful way to just kind of decrease this cognitive load and give them kind of more capacity to really understand what it is that you're trying to teach. And then finally, keeping videos less than 6 minutes is a really great strategy, and it's a really hard strategy. I have failed at this before, but I keep trying, and what the research shows is that this doesn't mean that you can only have 4 videos. You can't have 4 videos to watch before a class. You can have 4 videos, 6 minutes each, that they have to watch before they get to class. But the idea here is that students can kind of be keeping track and knowing how much information they are retaining or not retaining. So they don't get to the end of a 40-minute lecture and realize I zoned out at minute 25. They can get to the end of a 6-minute lecture, realize I need to listen to that again, go back and listen to it again. And it kind of chunks the material into much more manageable pieces. So it's just a nice way of making sure that students are able to kind of guide their own learning process by structuring the videos and breaking it down for students. So then moving on to accessibility. So again, like a lot of the things that we've been talking about, accessibility is essential to consider in an online course. And it's also really important to consider beforehand. It shouldn't be kind of a last minute thought about, oh, I might have a student who might want captions or something like that. And what's great is that there's so many resources that make this so easy. So captions on videos can be automatically created using Blackboard. And so if you use Kaltura to create your videos for your students, it'll take a little bit, but it'll automatically create captions for you. And the captions might be messy, it's very possible. And so it can be helpful to go in and edit the captions for students, but it's a very, very easy process. And then accessible documents. So all of these links are links to the different research and other resources. So you'll get this PowerPoint after. But this link to accessible documents is a CTRL resource about accessibility and all of the things that you have to think about for accessibility. So images and PowerPoints, making sure that they have alt text, PDF graphs, things like that. There's a lot that you have to think about, and that's a really good way to start, especially for online courses where it's a lot of electronic material that students are going to be sent, and you just want to make sure you're thinking about all of your students. And these can be for students who might have screen readers to access materials, color blindness, hearing disabilities, cognitive disability considerations, and it's essential to just make sure you're preemptively thinking about this before. So then on to transparency and humanization. So the idea here is just being transparent with your students. So this isn't a research-based kind of, it is research-based, but the idea here is that just be transparent with your students, and that can be really helpful. So for example, if I cite to my students the importance of multiple modalities for learning, my course is in psychology, so I do talk about different psychological myths, and so fortunately learning styles is one of them. And so we can talk about how learning styles are not what I'm trying to think about. What I'm thinking about is making sure that you get information in multiple ways. And the reason I'm doing that is because that's how we know that you're going to retain knowledge. And so that can be really helpful for students to understand, why am I watching a video after I just watched a really similar lecture? Well, because it's important. Obviously, it's not going to be the same exact content, but making sure that they have it in different ways is helpful. And then mistakes will happen for everyone, including for you and the students, and that's okay. Students might forget that they have class. You hopefully will not forget that you have class, but there will be things that happen. Announcements might get posted too early or too late. Anything can happen, and that's okay. And this is a new process for a lot of us teaching online. And so we are all human. Obviously, don't make a million mistakes and just say, it's okay, we're human, but do your best and assume that everyone else is doing their best as well. And so I wanted to show this slide kind of to just show the transparency of why I'm doing certain things with my students. I showed this graph to my students last semester, and it is a graph. The caption says, "Study shows students in active learning classrooms learn more than they think." And the idea here is that they compared two classes, a passive learning and an active learning class. And what they found was that the students preferred the passive learning class. They preferred to be lectured to. But when we looked at all of these different measures of academic performance, we found that they did better in the active learning class. So even though it wasn't the favorite type of learning environment, we found that it was better. So this is just one example of what I have shown to my students. I don't know if it worked completely, but I do know that a lot of my students really appreciated the transparency, and it did kind of create a light bulb moment of, okay, we're doing this group work because it's going to be helpful. And then kind of reflecting after the fact and seeing just how helpful all of these activities were can be really helpful for that transparency in the classroom. And then finally, some general time savers. Again, these are time savers that might or might not be applicable based on whatever your learning outcomes are. So multiple choice questions can grade themselves automatically. That can be really helpful if your learning outcomes lend themselves well to multiple choice questions. You can be creative and create multiple choice questions that kind of get at those higher order thinking skills that we saw on Bloom's taxonomy. So into the create and evaluate, you can craft multiple choice questions like that, but it is difficult. And so this kind of is what we think about when we think of online learning. It is a lot of upfront work. And this is one example where it is a lot of upfront work, but then in the actual facilitation and the grading, it can be a little bit easier. Grading students' assignments directly in Blackboard or whatever LMS you're using, it takes a while to kind of get used to, but before you know it, you are making comments directly into the document, writing notes about it, very easily creating a rubric and then grading using the rubric. If you haven't used rubrics in your assignments on Blackboard, it is such a time saver. Again, it's preemptive work, but it saves so much time. Quick way to get feedback to students, and just write them a couple of notes and then you're good to go, versus downloading all of the papers, grading them, sending them back, all of the other parts of that process. And then thinking about instructor presence. So I send a lot of reminders in my courses, and my students do get used to this. And so that is something that I make a commitment to keep doing, because I can't send them half the semester and then stop sending them after. My thinking there is that the more reminders I send, the less contingency plans that I'm going to need. So I don't have to think about what to do for late work or work that's not done adequately. If I can get to my students before they submit that final assignment, it'll just make my grading process much easier. And so sending those reminders, whether they're announcements on Blackboard, individual reminders to students, there's some nice ways to send a reminder to all students who haven't submitted an assignment in Blackboard. Those can really increase your presence in the course and really are helpful for outcomes in online courses. And then finally, the last time saver idea is to stay consistent, and as much as you can, come up with a structure and try to stick to that structure. It's helpful for your students to know what to expect, but it's also really helpful for you in terms of your planning. And so once you kind of have a structure, maybe every 3 weeks you have a discussion board post, and every week you have a synchronous Zoom session, whatever it is, it can be really helpful for yourself as you're planning your course, to create that structure first and then continue to stay consistent. So I'm going to go ahead and end the slideshow and stop sharing my screen. And I wanted to take some time for questions. So Lindsay, were there any questions that came up? I can go ahead and look in the chat too, but was there anything that came up during that we can get to, and then I'll kind of move into asking for other questions?
We've been monitoring the chat and answering them as we go, so I think we could just open it up to new questions at this point.
So I guess if you want to raise your hand to ask a question, that would be ideal. I see a question, what does the research say about the effectiveness of discussion boards? I can't think of anything specific in terms of like, other than they're helpful for the engagement for the course. And so whenever you are implementing discussion boards, that is another level of engagement that students are able to be a part of. So other than just they're good to implement as one resource within your online courses. And there are pros and cons again, and it doesn't mean implementing discussion boards instead of having any synchronous classes. It's just another tool that can kind of add that variety and the multiple modalities to the course. And so there's a couple of questions about the raise hand feature. And I don't remember where that is. So Lindsay, do you want to tell them where to raise their hands?
Yes. So if you open your participants window, like we did before to change your name, it'll have a list of all the participants. And at the bottom, there are a couple features, raise hand. You can give a yes, check mark, an X, no, but the raise hand should be the very left icon. And so you can see that I've raised my hand. Did everybody get that?
So there's a couple of other questions. I see
Mika has her hand up too, so.
Thank you, go ahead.
Okay, so my question is about multiple choice questions. So I can see how after an initial assignment, the multiple choice questions might be useful for me to get a sense of what students have understood. But I'm wondering two things. First, is there research on how useful they are for the students? Like, I'm sort of wondering if the students take a little online quiz before class and there's some multiple choice questions, does this actually have an impact? If they get it wrong, do they go back to their reading and try to figure out why it's wrong? So do we know anything about how students react to multiple choice questions? And secondly, is there a resource for writing good multiple choice questions? Because I certainly don't have any experience writing them. And in the course I'm teaching right now, there isn't any kind of, it doesn't come with a package of multiple choice questions from the publisher. So it would be helpful to have some guidance on how to make some if I wanted to use them as a quick check before class about what people had actually understood.
That's great. That's great that you're thinking of using them not just for summative assessments at the end, but the formative check-in of, did you understand this reading? So thinking about what students do when you give them feedback and information, what we know is that unless you grade it, they're probably not going to go back and do anything with it. And so in that case, it can be helpful to kind of have those opportunities for providing more information in their answers. And so if you marked it wrong, they can say why they got it wrong and why they know that it's correct now. But those things take a lot of time too. And so it just depends on whether or not that's going to be worth your time. And it's possible multiple choice questions might not be the best feature for whatever it is that you're asking your students about. Essay questions might be the better assessment tool, depending on whatever your learning outcomes are. So yeah, it depends on the learning outcomes. In terms of a resource, there's a lot of resources on good multiple choice questions. I can send those to you directly, but I'll also create a resource on the CTRL website. I imagine there might be something, but we'll find it and revamp it based on recent research, because there's a lot of resources and they're really difficult to make good multiple choice questions, and especially to get at those the higher order learning skills. So thank you. I see Paula, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I have two questions. Piggybacking on that last question about discussions. When teaching online, I have two common problems with them. So problem number one is that, sometimes I'll run like 2 discussion boards in a week. And the reason why I do it is because I assign reading, and it's like I can't manage to cover the content and put accountability on all the readings in one discussion forum. So sometimes I'll run 2, and then I hear from students that 2 is too much because it's labor intensive. So I'm thinking about maybe mixing up this time with a little bit of multiple choice, kind of low stakes, not much of the grade. kind of accountability features. So that's one possibility. We'll be curious about other thoughts you might have. And then the second problem I have is the structure of when they post and then they reply to two peers. I'm finding it problematic because I find that that's all they do. And they don't read the discussions, of course, that are happening in the other threads between other peers. And so that's where I find a hard time kind of replicating the classroom discussion. And I feel like they walk away with a limited understanding because it was just a little slice of conversation they had. So any thoughts about what we could do there?
Great questions and points to bring up. So I see the value of having the two discussion boards. I also see on the other end how much work that would be for students too. So it's good to consider other ways. I love the idea of multiple choice questions as a quick formative assessment to make sure that students either did the reading, read the reading thoroughly. And then thinking about the discussion boards themselves, this is another place where students, as many of you know, need explicit instructions, and kind of writing that line between explicit instructions and not giving them, you know, write 3 sentences, make sure one is a point about how well this other discussion board was written. Just making sure that they know exactly what is to be expected on the board can be really helpful. That's another resource I can send out some instructions that I've used on discussion boards and how I kind of structure it beyond just the time structuring, but how I tell them what they need to be doing in their initial post and after. So make sure that you comment, make sure that you have, I always make sure they have citations, APA formatted citations, and it has to be obviously relevant to whatever the post was about. They can use my textbook as their citation, just giving them exactly what I would find to be a good discussion board and a way to kind of make sure that it's engaging discussion. And then recognizing that they might not go back and read all the discussion board posts. This is a place where, depending on how many students you have, I have 40 students. And so that can be a lot. And so using groups within Blackboard or whatever your learning management system is can be really helpful. So within groups, you can have discussion boards just for certain groups of students, randomly assigned or assigned by discipline. I've done it both ways. And in my experience, I've had them just randomly assigned in some graduate courses that I've taught online. I've found it better to kind of do a survey at the beginning and then put them kind of in discipline specific groups. That's worked really well. A lot of trial and error with this stuff, but discussion boards are a tough one. And so I can share the instructions and I can share my rubric. I see Anthony just posted that they share a rubric. Personally answer students and answer questions. So modeling is really helpful, but it is a tough one. And so I'm interested in hearing other ideas too.
Yeah, really helpful to hear about the group function and doing the discussion within the group. So yeah, with how many resources you have that you can send out. Thank you.
Yeah, I love the groups function in Blackboard. It's really helpful. Once you get past 15 even, it can be tough. I don't see any other hands raised, I don't think. Any other questions? Oh, I do.
There's a hand up by Stacy Selling, and then Karen Johnson.
Hey, thank you, and thanks, Erin, for all your work on this. You know, my question is a good follow-up to Paula's, because one of the things that I observed when we went from face online was overcompensation that faculty felt they had to do discussion posts, synchronous learning, and it almost was students were drinking, so to speak. Wondering how we help faculty and coach them about what is the appropriate balance here if we are suggesting synchronous learning, yet we want them engaged, yet they have 5 classes, possibly 15 credits. So I want us all to be all of the 5 different approaches we all take, and yet they have one, you know, there's one student at the end. But how we strike the balance between, you know, synchronous learning and asynchronous learning, so we're just not over extending students because we feel compensate. So any comments you have on that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And the spring was hard. We all did our best, and overcompensating was an issue for sure, because we care, because we want our students to be learning, and we just want to make sure that they're getting the information in this new odd environment. There are some resources that are explicit estimates of how long it should take students to do certain things. I think, so it's Rice University Course Load Calculator. That can be a really nice tool to look at to just estimate how long it might be taking students to be doing these things, whether it's a 50-page reading and a discussion board post and a 30-minute synchronous class. There are pros and cons to the synchronous classes and pros and cons to all of these other strategies. Eric just put the workload calculator into the chat. Thanks, Eric. I usually say to start with that and just kind of experiment how long these things might be taking. And so the synchronous classes are nice because it's really similar to what we're used to. We prep for an hour and then we lecture for an hour, typically. And students are used to that too. And so there's a lot of extra work that might go into transitioning from that synchronous lecture to finding something on the internet, sharing it on a discussion board. It can be really tough. So looking at that course workload calculator, looking at how many credit hours you have, and Carnegie has certain numbers of hours in terms of how much time students should be spending on their course. That can maybe be another good place to start the discussion if you're engaging in these discussions. So I think that's a great point, Stacy. Did you have any other thoughts or questions related to that? Did I answer it?
No, I think having some guidelines, and I think just our own awareness, right? That, we may only have two classes, but a student has 5, and we have 5 different. And my understanding is that there is a push to have synchronous classes at least some of the time. And so it's not going to be entirely online where you would rely on discussion posts. So I think this is just a lot of moving parts for all of us to wrap our heads around, right? In order to use these tools appropriately and too overzealous. But thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to bring up for both ourselves and our students. Yeah. Keho, do you see another hand up?
Yes, it was Karen Johnston.
Hi, thank you, Erin. I'm actually interested in attention span. We had in another one of these discussions, someone saying that the students have essentially an 8-minute attention span, and that in organizing, especially the asynchronous or, in organizing your classes, you need to sort of pay attention to that. And I was wondering whether you had any references to that, either in the research or between synchronous and asynchronous. Is it really accurate to say, you think in 8-minute or 10-minute sections for whatever kind of tools you use, if you have anything to say about that? Thank you.
That's a great question. And there's a lot of estimates. Some people have talked about the age being the number of minutes that you have in terms of attention span. There's a lot of estimates. The 6-minute estimate for how long video should be is based on a lot of that research. And there's a lot of different estimates. So there's no, rule of thumb of how long our attention span is, other than that it's bad. And it's bad for us. And it's not bad, but it's not what we think it is. It is only something like 6 or 8 minutes where you can kind of be paying attention and then be able to kind of focus and metacognitively know if you're still paying attention and if you're still able to be understanding whatever it is. So the 8-minute is one measure, but that's where we get that 6-minute videos as kind of what we're looking for. Did you have a second part of your question, Stacy?
No, I asked it, but no, I was just curious, just in terms of our own sort of strategy and how to organize, the discussion boards or, the video, how you organize that. That was my
Gotcha. Yeah, and thinking about that is helpful too for even your synchronous sessions where, you know, we have an hour of time right now, and so I really wanted to have some time to just throw some information out there and then move on to this Q&A period. In a class with students, I would definitely have more time to break, not just to make it interesting, but because I know they can't sit there for an hour and really be taking it all in. So the 8 minutes is a nice number. I don't know what the exact number would be. I don't think there is an exact number though. That's a good point to bring up though for all of our teaching.
We have Anthony and then Anitra and then Mary.
Hello, I have a general question. The question that was just asked in the chat was very helpful. That I guess was just answered. My general question is, has AU, because I've asked this to every single person in every department and everybody I can possibly ask and have not received an answer, have we had any guidance about instructing students in other countries like People's Republic of China, where 50 to 60% of my students are, that are behind a firewall, where I teach a class on Washington, D.C., the Washington Post is not allowed there. And although they can access things via VPNs, that is technically against the law in their country to access a lot of things from the United States. And the list changes and grows and moves with different political realities between the two countries. So has the university said anything about that? Because my students are 12 hours apart from me, some of them.
That's a great point for several reasons, as you brought up. One of the points you brought up was getting access to different, you said New York Post or another newspaper. Within Blackboard, you can embed a lot of materials that way, and they can access the course material that way. Thinking about your question about VPN and what is actually legal or not legal, that what we typically say is to do that on a case-by-case basis, but the best way to kind of preemptively think about that is to make sure that all materials are written within your syllabus. And so in the spring, obviously we couldn't have known that that was what was going to happen, but for student safety, and that's the one piece of advice that we've been giving, is to just make sure that it's explicitly outlined in your syllabus. And then just making sure that you use, whether it's a VPN or Blackboard, to share course content. I know that that's not the best answer, but it sounds like you're doing everything that you can be doing to be mindful of this. So
cool, I do. I appreciate it. I put all the stuff up there, including if it has to be a link, like for something that you can't just PDF because it doesn't work. You know, I say, do not access this if it's in your country, it doesn't work. But my concern is that monitoring the students, and we get monitored doing this. So even if they're on a VPN or anything else, just because we're providing it to them through Blackboard, which, by the way, is allowed to operate in People's Republic of China, which is why this all works. But the university still hasn't said anything about the legality of providing sedition information to them, because that's what they see it as.
Hey, Anthony, I have an idea. What about, just to try it, even to test out, is maybe ask those students who have this legal impediment, which I see is the biggest one aside from the time difference for now, and say, okay, what can they come up with working with you as ideas using their own materials that are accessible that would still help with the learning outcomes? So maybe they're not sourcing the Post, but they're sourcing the South China Morning Post. But give them the room to sort of come up with ideas that can still meet their learning and help you solve this, as even just to try it.
Oh, I don't even, I've already taken care of this. I don't even listen to it. Like, from my perspective, this is just me trying to get an answer from the university as to their concerns about this stuff, because I put it all up there, the readings, having them put something up about about our protests and things like that, that's fine. They can do that. But I'm not going to put up, propaganda, which is exactly what it is, up to teach them about Washington, D.C., because my course is about D.C. And that's problematic, particularly with this. So I'll stop.
I will ask this question to the Dean of Faculty and try to come back to you with an answer. And you're right, I haven't heard a general policy about this. And so I will pursue this question and see if something could be resolved.
I appreciate it.
I'm going to turn the mic over to Brett. I'm sorry, Brett.
Sure, no problem, thanks. So I kind of have two questions. My first question has to do with the class time, because I teach 3-hour block classes. And so I've been concerned about how much of that time I should be using synchronously versus maybe having asynchronous component built into that. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak to maybe the maximum amount of time that's recommended to spend like in asynchronous content. And then my second question has to do with the multiple screen sharing feature in Zoom. I actually saw a presentation where that was done last week, and I'm just not really sure how you do that in Zoom. So I was wondering if you could also comment on how you can create the multiple screen look within Zoom.
So the screen sharing, I do not know, but I am excited to find an answer to that, and I will. And referring to the class time in terms of asynchronous hours, I've searched for recommendations and, you know, what is the best way to do it. And it seems to be on a case-by-case basis. It's what you feel comfortable with. And 3 hours online, 2.5 hours online is a long time. And so mixing it up with, you know, an hour of synchronous instruction, and then also having a discussion board and a wiki for them to fill out, another paper for them to write. The issue is that you don't want to then overcompensate too, and because that kind of work is really difficult for students to do. So yeah, there's no rule of thumb based on research of what would be the best to do. So at this point, I would say do what's been working for you and what you're comfortable with, and kind of change it as you go along. I'm sorry that's not like a sufficient exact answer.
Before we go on to the next, I would also suggest talking to your students and see what ideas they may have about what works for them, and use co-construct a space where both you and your students are figuring out what would work best in that online learning environment. And with that, we have Mary Hanson, then Scott, and then Paula.
Hey there. I would like to go back to something that Nanette and I posted a little earlier on the, oh, my video does not want to turn on. There we go. On the chat, we'd like to know more about what the correspondence between the different levels on the taxonomy and suggestions of useful activities, particularly useful active learning activities. Right? So what does the research say about if we're on step 1? Here are the things you should really be focusing on doing to achieve, or you're on step 3 in your did I make my question clear? I hope.
I think so. And if I don't answer clearly, just let me know. So yeah, so having within whatever level of Bloom's taxonomy you're in, whether you remember or analyze, and then what would be a good follow-up type of activity. There's no kind of exact match at all. And I think that's why you can do a discussion board at many levels of Bloom's taxonomy. You can do a discussion board to find out if students can remember certain concepts. And if, you know, you say, talk about one concept from the reading today, and they just kind of define it, and then that's all it has to be, versus kind of creating something on their own, creating a YouTube video, sharing it as a discussion board post, and then responding to each other. But there's not really a way to align kind of which learning outcome level would be best for which instructional strategy.
Maybe then we could have some help from CTRL in creating, maybe there's some discipline-specific research out there on things that people have tried that we can find examples of.
Yes.
Something that will make it easier for people who have never really thought about these things.
Absolutely.
to enter into this conversation, right? I've been thinking about it for 20 years, but I have a lot of colleagues who haven't. And I'm here to try and figure out how to help them much more, so I mean, I could do this research, but then I don't have time to prep my own class. So
yeah, that's what we're here for. Yeah. And definitely, we'll meet and talk about this.
Yeah. But I don't think it's unusual, like, and it is in some ways very discipline specific, right?
Yeah, for sure. And whenever this all started back in March, what we were sharing was kind of, what are you doing in person? And here's how you can do that online. And that's not the way that we should approach online teaching, of course. We should think about the outcomes and then think about the assessments, but it was an emergency. And this is a similar situation where, well, how do I adequately evaluate? And so maybe coming up with some type of structure, discipline specific, that might say, well, you can make sure students are evaluating by doing it this way on a discussion board or whatever it is. So there's no kind of framework for that, but I'd be interested in creating somewhat of a framework, at least as kind of a starting point for that. That's a good point. Yeah. Thanks, Mary. Kia, who's next?
Scott, are you up?
Yeah. Hey, it's not so much a question. It was more an observation to see if others found this too. But in the spring semester, it was, of course, so interesting to have the first half in person and the second half online. And what I noticed, and what students noticed too, is that the exact same people that talked in person in class were the same people that talked online. And I'm wondering if others experienced this, and if they didn't, what do they think are the reasons? Because it was somewhat surprising in a sense, and I want to involve more voices, not the same voices.
So you're saying, can you clarify that? So you're saying in the spring,
the same exact students in the second half of the semester when we were online, out of a class of 45, the same 5 students spoke. The same 5 that.
Oh, I see.
The same 5 that spoke in the first half in class. So it didn't matter whether it was in person or online. It was only the same 5 students that were doing the majority of the speaking.
Interesting.
Yeah. Can I actually echo Scott? So I agree with that. This is Mika. And
hi, Mika.
Hi. The other problem is that at least this past spring, I did allow a lot of them to have their cameras off because they were, in their bedroom or whatever. And with their cameras off, you also can't see their face, which you could see in class. And so it's really challenging with those quiet students who didn't speak anyway. And I also am curious whether people have suggestions about things, cold calling someone is really hard. And when I did that, which I did do in desperation, there was just complete silence. I didn't know if they weren't there, or they were just totally, upset or what. So thoughts about getting the quiet people online. Yeah.
Interesting point about the camera, about being on camera and not on camera too, because I encountered the same challenge.
Yeah, I'd like to open that up too. If others can put in the chat their experiences with students participating, and then maybe any other thoughts about video. My initial thought with video, I typically don't require students to have it, but then you need some other type of structure to ensure that students are engaging and that they are listening and engaging with the course material. In terms of students who participated in the face-to-face and then and then continued to be the same ones who participated in the second half of the course, I'd be interested to know if others found the same thing. One of the nice things about online teaching is that it gives opportunities for students who might not otherwise be, might not want to engage in the face-to-face courses for a variety of reasons. They have that opportunity in the online courses. And so I'd be interested to know, maybe there was something about having that structure in the face-to-face course and having those roles that they were used to, if perhaps that impacted their engagement differently than what we usually see in online courses. So I think it's an interesting point to bring up, Scott.
All right, the next 2 questions are from Paula and then Naomi.
Yeah. Thank you. So I was just kind of interested if you had any ideas or feedback from here, if anyone does. So teaching my research methods undergraduate online in the fall. This will be the first time I teach that class online. And, you know, I know that I cannot put them online for an hour and lecture at them about sampling and things like that. So I'm thinking of kind of doing like a flip the class type of thing, even though it's mostly online, and kind of pre-recording like some short, you know, videos on different research methods concepts, and then having them watch those. And then I was thinking for the synchronous component, I could potentially run some of them like a Q&A, so then they have to show up to the session, maybe with a certain number of questions or something, to do it more discussion oriented. And I'm just wondering, does anyone have any experience doing that? Would the best thing to have them, you know, put them in the chat feed? I'm hearing people saying that if you did it on video with everyone in there, some people didn't talk. So just kind of curious about any thoughts.
Erin, if you can summarize the essence of the question, because I think the audio quality was not that great.
Yeah. So the question was about implementing a flipped classroom model potentially in a research methods course. So that means making sure students do all the prep work beforehand. And so watching lectures the same way that instead of doing it in class, they could watch a lecture at home, and then they come to class prepared, and spending the class kind of as a Q&A period. And that's a great method, and especially for research methods courses. Eric Schuler, who's in CTRL, is thinking about some type of a research methods focused discussion on online teaching. So that's potentially coming out for maybe the August faculty workshops. But at just your first description, Paula, this is a great method, and flipped classrooms are amazing. Even if you don't have to do it online, it's a really great technique. There's a lot riding on it, of course. You have to make sure that students do the readings and watch the videos, maybe having some formative assessments beforehand so that they come to class prepared for the Q&A portion. But what you're describing is a wonderful model, and one that's been used a lot, and there are other resources on that. And so I've promised a lot of resources, and I have Post-it notes everywhere of just like all the random resources I'm going to send. But if I don't get to it, feel free to email me, and I'll work to find either the research to back up whatever you're looking for, or we can talk more about it. But at face value, Paula, that sounds great.
So we have Naomi Moland.
Yes, hi. There we go. Okay. So I just wanted to share real quick, because it was easier than putting it in the chat box, that one thing that I found super helpful for engagement was the poll function. So a lot of times I would just put up like a quick poll during the middle of class that would say, you know, like, this author that we're reading, does he fall more on the continuum? If we're discussing the continuum between cultural hybridity and cultural convergence, where does he fall more on this line? And then I would give like 3 multiple choice answers. And then in Blackboard, I liked it because you could see what someone answered. So if somebody answered like cultural convergence, then I would cold call them and say, oh, why did you answer that? And so I could see what people answered themselves. I haven't figured out how to do that in Zoom yet, but with Blackboard you can see, because I was playing with both of those different options, but you can see what someone answered. And so as far as engagement, that was also, I did it several times in class so that I could see if someone had left the room, you know, or if they weren't paying attention at all. And so doing frequent polls like that, and then seeing who's answering. And then if somebody didn't answer, I could be like, you know, Connor, are you there? That was a way to kind of check in with students a lot. And so that was a good way of engaging them, and doing cold calling as well.
That's a really great use.
That was just that was a comment, but the question is, does anybody know how to do that in Zoom? I guess that would be a question, because it's super useful to be able to see. I mean, you get the results from the poll where it says, you know, 14 people said A, 15 people said B, but I really liked it that in Blackboard Collaborate, you can see who answered what, and then you can just ask them why they answered that, and that was a good way to bring up people that didn't usually participate.
Yeah, so the university got access to Zoom. Yeah, thank you. They got access to Zoom pretty like into the whole whole thing. So they're still working on those resources, but I made a note of that as kind of one thing that would be helpful, because ideally if Blackboard, Collaborate, and Zoom could do all the same things and then we could just use what we prefer, that would be great. So, and that's a great way to do the formative assessment. And I mean, you're getting at so many things. Students are motivated to stay engaged and pay attention and know what's going on. A lot of benefits to the practices that you're using, Naomi.
I don't see any more hands up in the chat box. And so while people are thinking about more questions to ask, I would also want to put in a pitch for all of you, because one of the things that we want to do is be responsive to all of your needs. And we won't be able to do that if we don't hear from you directly. We get some sense of that from discussions with unit heads and deans, but those are really broad brush kinds of needs. And if there are specific questions you might have or specific kinds of workshops you're looking for, we can definitely collate that information and look for critical mass, or even reach out to you individually to help you all out. And so really CTRL is here as a resource for all of you, and we're happy to accommodate those questions and needs and other ways we can help. Any other questions from the participants? All right, let's see. There's nothing in the chat box. I think we addressed most of them. And so unless there are any questions that people are interested in, we can give back people 7 minutes and thank them for helping out and participating in this workshop.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It was great to hear some of the concerns that you're having. We just finished analyzing the survey results that many of you responded to about the spring semester, and anything else that you want to share, feel free to email me or CTRL, schedule an appointment, and we'll do a one-on-one consultation. We just want to be supporting you. And so if I was unable to answer every single question during this workshop, I'll find the answers, and that's what we're here for. So thank you for spending some time with us today, and I'll hang out for a little bit if there are any additional questions. Thanks all.
Thank you, very helpful. Hey, Aaron, if you're hanging around, at that last part was interesting about the Zoom and the polls, and then about when you got on and Blackboard and all that. And that's one thing that I've tried to be cognizant of, is how many different platforms potentially students could be using, because there's no one platform. And that's, of course, a switching cost for them, getting used to it. They might have 3 classes on Blackboard, 1 on Zoom, 1 on Google Hangouts. And that's, we're not going to know because we don't talk to other teachers like that. But that's something to, I think, would helps a professor admit it to themselves and share that with class, and also be a little bit more flexible.
I think that's a good reminder. It'd be great if we could have kind of a one tool for all of this. It'd probably be easier, but there are benefits to having the multiple tools, so I get that too. And then just speaking to the need for explicit instructions for students, because they are using many. You're absolutely right. Yeah,
and they could literally go from, I mean, I'm sticking with Blackboard because it's approved, it's secure, it's got the student's name, and it works. The breakout groups are just phenomenal. And I find, not ironically, I find the answer to one of my questions about students not speaking is that you put them in the breakout groups and they speak, especially if you're not there, and just hop into each one and say, hey, any questions, what's going on, as opposed to being a parent figure just there the whole time. You're just hopping in and out, letting them do the work. Yeah, it kind of feels like a real face-to-face environment too. It's nice. I'm glad to hear at least that you were experiencing that with some of your students, even though sometimes you were experiencing that they were still not talking, that some of them were talking in the groups. There's a big difference. One is a breakout group with 5 to 8 people versus a class of 40 to 45. And the breakout group most of the time doesn't have the professor there. And the main class has the professor there. So it sort of makes some sense, but I'm still fascinated how almost 100% online mirrored in real life in terms of who spoke in class. That the screen didn't provide any sort of extra avenue in or make it easier for discussion.
Yeah.
Hey, Scott, I'm really curious. Were they not even chatting in terms of, typing in comments? Did you find a difference there too?
The chats, definitely the chats, but with a class of 40 to 45, the chats become very tough to navigate.
Yeah.
So I like that it exists. And what I do that I found effective, Paul and Aaron, there is I'll simply ask, hey, do you want to spend more time on this? And then, they'll do a thumbs up or a yes. Or I'll ask something specific, or ask them to share a link. That's another thing. If a student says, oh, there's this XXXYZ cool thing, I'll say, hey, can you put that link in chat for us? And then maybe I'll even open it up. So it can work. I like the polling. And I think this hits, Aaron's, your point about the different things to try and be engaged and not just rely on always lecturing or always talking, that there's these other things that can happen within a class, especially online.
Yeah, and I see your point with having chats, especially if you have like 40, 45 students, and that's what I was thinking too about that kind of Q&A type of thing. It's like you don't have someone there to monitor the chat for you, right? And kind of put questions. So, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and even with a course assistant, which is sometimes in some classes, it's, it can be a lot. It's helpful. There's no doubt it's helpful. And it's just the class size is tough. But the breakout groups is really, to me, the solution. Break it down. And it also breaks up the class into something more digestible, something, Aaron, you talked about.
Yeah, maybe have them work on trying to work together to solve the questions, and then I can pop into the room and see how each group did at some point. Yeah.
Exactly. So.
Thanks.
Scott, have you tried to, because
yes,
I do, because I have so many students and, well, not so many. I have a handful of students who traveled back to China with not very good internet access or connections. So sometimes what I do is I actually turn the entire week to an asynchronous session. So then everybody will have to contribute meaningfully to conversations, to these asynchronous discussions. And then maybe the following week, what I do is I gave them tasks to do that they can do offline, well, not offline, but asynchronously.
Right.
Group work. Or so then what I do is that the designated class time, I use it for different groups. And so I have a lot of students in this one class that I'm teaching now. So I split the class into 4 smaller groups. And so I meet them for about 40, 45 minutes, just that group. And everybody has to participate in the conversation. So they have to do extensive reading before that. Or sometimes what I do is I say, okay, there are 8 or 10 texts, some of them are videos or radio reports or whatever. So watch, read, take notes, and then, tell each other about the information. And so that's how we can explore the topic. My point is that way everybody will have to say something. And so you don't have quiet people because they get a good amount of points for it. It's,
right.
The incentive is right there.
And you also put it on them to sort of do the work and work together. And
right.
Yeah, I like that idea. And I did think of switching in the last semester to partially asynchronous, but then I said, there's enough turmoil. I'm going to keep strictly to synchronous because that's what they signed up for. And some students in the West had to wake up at 6:30 in the morning, and it became actually a funny thing because they couldn't believe they were doing it. Oh, I'll share an interesting insight in a moment, but let me finish this thought. So I'm still not sure about the fall. If we go online, I might do some mix of part synchronous and then part what you're saying is asynchronous.
Yeah.
But I do want to keep to our class times as much as possible, because that way, here's why. One student she was waking up at the West, and she says she hates to wake up early, but what she found was she thought asynchronous would be better. And her asynchronous classes, she fell behind because she couldn't manage herself. She found that the synchronous, when you were sort of held responsible, you had to show up, including wake up at 6:30 a.m., was better. And it was a really interesting insight to hear that, because listen, if we were all, each of us, so great, we wouldn't need others to be accountable for. We'd be like, super people, just able to do stuff without anyone. A professor just wrote me today, when does that chapter due? I know I'm responsible to her. So it's just interesting about the synchronous, asynchronous, about managing oneself and the inability to manage yourself if you're asynchronous.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I have to run in a couple of minutes, and so I just wanted to make sure that I closed out the session.
Thank you.
Y'all feel free to, I don't know, can they stay on here, Lindsay?
Yeah, I'll stay and hang out and leave the meeting open, and anybody can feel free to continue discussing.
All right. It was really great to talk with all of you. Thanks for staying
Erin.
on and continuing.
Thanks, Erin.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Hey, Lindsay, what's any other ideas or topics that are coming up or you're batting about for future CTRL sessions ahead?
Oh yeah, so I just finished working with all the presenters for e-learning support and our team, and we have a full summer schedule starting next week. And I'm hoping that this email will go out tomorrow or Thursday. But yeah, some of the events we have. We did a lot of, in the spring, because it was an emergency situation, a lot of tool-based workshops, and we really want to get, now that people have kind of got their feet wet, we're going to move into more pedagogy and more how to keep students engaged focused workshops. So, I mean, we've got increasing social presence in your online courses, student engagement in the virtual classroom, teaching with open educational resources. We got some Blackboard things coming up, but it's a full summer. So
that's great. That's great. I find them invaluable and wonderful.
Yeah. So everybody should be receiving an email by the end of this week with a full list of workshops.
That's really good, because I think, based on the questions that you just received a few minutes ago, I can't remember who it was, but it's like, okay, can you give us an example of like, what does an assignment look like that meets Bloom's taxonomy, that level and that level. And so that's the tricky part, coming up with, an assignment that meets several criteria and also want to engage students. Yeah.
Right. This one is a nice one. It kind of, this workshop, just because it sort of sets you up to ask questions like, okay, but how do I keep students engaged? And then hopefully when you see this list of workshops, you're like, oh, I'll attend student engagement in the virtual classroom. So we can dive a little deeper. So. Right. Yeah.
Awesome. I will keep my eye out and see you ahead online in the future.
Great. Thanks, Scott.
See you, Lindsay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you, Evelyn.
Bye.
See you.
Okay, if no one has any further questions, I think I'll close this up. Thank you all for joining us. Okay, let's see here.